Hello, I'm Sarah from Dynamic Boards, and with me today is Barry Gamble. Hi, Barry.
Hello, Sarah.
Barry is an experienced NED and chair, and he's a self-professed oddball. He's got a background with science, accounting, sales, marketing, general management, lots of experience there, and he writes on all topics related to boards. He writes in the Share Society, Board Agenda, he's written in the Financial Times, sends letters into them, and BoardX as well. Gary is one to sort of enjoy the controversy around a lot of these board topics, and he's hosted debates on topics that he thinks boards need to be discussing. So one of the ones that he hosted before that maybe we can kick off by asking you about now, Barry, is this house believes that the boards of tomorrow should not recruit the board members of today. How did that one go, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, that was fascinating. I managed to have Heather McGregor, who used to be Mrs. Moneypenny in the Financial Times, and she writes regularly in the Sunday Times business columns. She proposed that debate, and I had a woman fund manager oppose it, supported, I have to say, in both cases by able men. But probably most interesting thing was the insight that emerged, particularly the arguments opposing that view, because I'm sure that people's general thought would be, well, of course, that makes sense that we would support a motion and we should be seeking to appoint different NEDs in the future. So I think there was a lot of insight emerged as to, well, what are the challenges to trying to achieve this? And you could have heard a penny drop at time, I have to say, in terms of some of the really powerful things that were said in that forum.
Yeah, I can imagine that, that people enjoy the extreme views sometimes, and the extreme view is we need all this fresh thinking on boards. But the reality is we also need to work collaboratively with those that have an awful lot of skill and experience. So actually, I'd probably end up favouring the mix it up perspective of have a bit of both. Because we've got a huge amount of skill, experience and governance experience on our boards, and it would be a shame to, at a quick dash, lose all of that.
Yeah, I think that is the very, very word. It is a matter of making sure it's mixed. I mean, at the risk of plugging a product, you sure in your gin and tonic of an evening, Sarah, you might have the Fever Tree, and they have that wonderful sort of advertising expression, mix with the best. Well, you could almost apply that to boards, really, couldn't you? What you are trying to do is you want a diversity of thinking, you want some challenge, you want some respectful debate. That should really be underpinning how boards take place. And you can only really have that with a counter view, or even encourage as well those who might be perhaps, almost typecast as having a particular view, try to encourage them to explore the alternative. It's amazing what insights can emerge if you ask someone to try to represent and argue from another viewpoint.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, on that topic, do you think we debate enough in UK boards?
I think it's difficult to see that there wouldn't be scope to be more debateful, more inclusive in the approach. I'm not sure I like that word debateful, Sarah. I think it's difficult. It's difficult, I think, to argue that we do necessarily debate as well as we could do. And I think there's a massive benefit comes from being prepared to explore the alternative view, to have good, respectful debate, which has to be preceded by a huge amount of listening. You can only debate if you've listened very, very carefully to the alternative point of view, and rather than necessarily a board just rubber stamping a decision, far healthier, much better all round for board process and for the solidity of decisions being taken or not being taken if they've been explored from a number of angles, and say the real insights emerge. Either that the decision that's in front of the board should be thought and reflected upon, or changed or amended, or not proceeded with, or alternatively the board just says, well, actually, as a result of that debate and really exploring the alternatives, we're now absolutely convinced that it's the right thing to do. There's a massive value to emerge, I think, from that thorough process. It takes time, takes some patience, but I think it's a very necessary thing to be doing.
How do you feel like that, what you've just described and the need for debate balances with the increased in rigorous governance in the UK and the sort of requirement for boards to, I mean, some see it as tick a lot of boxes?
Well, I think there's an immense challenge, isn't there? I think there's a real challenge in terms of setting the board agenda at the moment, because the level of what I call the prescriptive rules, the compliance agenda, all the various boxes that need to be ticked is absolutely massive. And I think it's a massive stretch to the board's bandwidth to make sure that it stays fresh, clear-headed, energetic, to properly spend the times on things that matter. You know, they do recognise that they've got a business to run, that they've got customers that need to be looked after. They've probably got a product process that needs to be addressed. They've got marketing, and they've got positioning, and their reputation to defend. They need to make sure their IT system is secure and not going to get attacked by some alien cyber sort of approach. So the fact is, there's a huge agenda, and the board needs to my mind, the biggest challenge of the lot, the board needs to remain very, very strategic. Needs to be mindful of where it is operationally, but needs to be very, very strategic. And I think it needs to deal with all its compliance agenda and that very, very heavy load, in a thorough way, but not to dominate the agenda. Frankly, whoever's chairing a board these days have got a bit of a tough job on their hands to try and, on the one hand, make sure there's proper airtime, people are given time to talk about things, but at the same time, things do not dominate the agenda, and the board just gets worn out by compliance, which I think is a significant danger.
Definitely. And I know, Barry, one of your passions is sort of values and culture in a board. How have you seen that change in the last sort of 10, 20 years? Do you think that's rising up the agenda, and is it rising up enough?
Well, I'm sort of sufficiently old-fashioned enough to perhaps, and I'll use that expression, that, with my age and background and whatever, and my training, that when all's said and done, the only thing that really matters is one's integrity, and that people trust you in what you're doing. And I do believe there is actually quite a danger in you can tick the boxes on the rules, but what you're doing probably doesn't, totally pass muster. It's probably just not quite the right thing. So I think there is a significant challenge for boards in making sure we're doing that. Of course, we've latterly discovered, haven't we, Section 172 of the 2006 Companies Act, as if we'd never quite got round to Section 172 with a Companies Act, that we've had for 15 years. And that is all about these wider considerations, not just the narrow view of the board protecting its reputation, protecting the reputation of the executive, the non-executives, the immediate business. It's about, is the business being run for a wider, under wider consideration? So, Section 172, suddenly very, very fashionable. It's been there for a long time, but actually it was way into good thinking way before 2006. So I do believe that culture, values is way, way more important than necessarily just slavishly following the rules.
It's an interesting point, Barry, because I'm not going to get it right off the top of my head, but I know Section 172, and for those who don't know, and maybe you're just starting in your governance career, it encourages boards or requires boards to consider their wider stakeholders, including their suppliers, their customers, their employees, I can't remember if it says the communities that they work in, but it definitely says the environment. So there's quite a few. I think we came up with, was there 6 or 7 different points? But actually in the last year, one of the things I've been recognizing that isn't there, the environment is there, but not global citizens. So actually, whenever you think, okay, who should we be considering and how we make decisions? I think, there possibly has been a new category. The pandemic makes us recognize that some of the decisions we're making actually do impact globally. particularly when it comes to COVID vaccines and how that rollout's done. And global citizens isn't one of the stakeholders on the list. So curious as to how that will evolve over time. But I agree with you, Barry. It's been really helpful for a reminder that boards need to be thinking more broadly about the impact that they have. It's a bit of a check. I guess the risk is it's also a tick box if you work your way through each of those stakeholder groups. But it is a good check.
Let me, if I may, try and make a slightly broader point on this, that I think that, the focus we're now seeing on ESG, let's not forget that G stands for governance, and that underpins all this. I think Section 172 could be very clearly fitted within that. There is, I think, a significant challenge. You look at what's happened, say, quite recently. The BBC have just recently had this Dyson report into the background as to what went on with this interview with Diana, the late Diana, Princess of Wales, all those years ago. And whatever happened, and whatever energy the executive put to keep the existence and issues surrounding that away from the non-executives of the board, the non-executives couldn't be argued to have done their job, and whether that was because they didn't ask the right questions, they didn't challenge the executive enough. And there's a sense in which, and we've seen this recently as well with the post office, haven't we, with the Horizon accounting, Fujitsu accounting scandal, that too often organizations will naturally look to protect themselves. They look to protect the reputation of the organization, the short term, I have to say, the reputation of the non-executives, the reputation of the executive, whereas in actual fact, they're not really doing the right thing. And I think somehow or other, picking up your point on global citizens, we've all got to look in the mirror. We've got to face people, we've got to face our own conscience about what we're doing. And I think that's been reinforced by COVID, but it was always there. It was always there.
It highlights that sometimes the thing that the non-execs should be most worried about is what's not in the board papers.
Absolutely. That is the real challenge. And so how do they keep fresh of mind, have sufficient energy, sufficient attention bandwidth to look around the corner and ask those questions? I put particular store in always being prepared to pursue the little things. If you see things that are happening that just cause you to be a little concerned about the value set and culture and the way in which things operate, what does that tell you about what might be going in the organization? And an absolute classic would be, say, expenses. If you start and see things happening, chief executive expenses, you start to see things happening which just leave you just ever so slightly marginally. Someone is just slightly pushing the way things are. That's just a leading indicator in itself. That maybe something you don't need to fuss about, but it can just be a little bit of an indicator as to where the culture is and where it may be going. And so the real challenge for the non-executives is to develop a nose for it and try and pursue and ask those questions. There have still been myriad examples, haven't we, where the board has been left just completely oblivious to major blow-ups that have gone on. We've had it with Patisserie Valerie or whatever was going on there. I don't know, coming off air. We have it the drinks company, Conviviality. We've had it with Carillion. We've had it recently in Germany with Wirecard. We've had it with, whatever was going on in Greensill and some of those companies. Whatever was going on, clearly the board was not actually totally at the top of its game, and the non-executives were not fully informed, or they didn't ask the right questions.
Yeah, and you wonder, Barry, where were the clues? Even if it wasn't transparently shown to the board that these governance issues were happening in the organisation, surely there were some clues and some hints that if you had followed up on them, the small things like you mentioned, then you would have spotted sooner what was going on in the organisation. The other thing I often think is, if you're only talking to the people around the board table, you're probably not hearing enough voices.
Yeah.
Because actually there's not that many executives there. And It's so helpful to hear, particularly from the next level down outside of the boardroom, what they're thinking, what they're seeing.
Yeah, no, you see, you've got two schools of thought on this. You've got now, we've been pushed down a route, haven't we, possibly by the FRC to a degree, that because of the dominance of non-executives, then the executive on a board is essentially the CEO and the CFO, and maybe one or a couple of others. But at the end of the day, what the board sees is primarily through the optic of the chief executive and the CFO. So they're very much in charge of the agenda and the data flow. And whilst some non-execs say, well, it's important, I always operate totally through the chief executive, and I don't want to undermine the chief executive. But on the other hand, I would argue, and I know I come across a lot of non-execs who would hold this view as well.
Yeah,
it's actually healthy. If you've got a good non-exec, why should he be bothered? You're going to have a word with managers or turn up at sites or whatever it might be, and certainly talking to customers, suppliers, getting a feel of what's going on with the organization is absolutely essential. It cannot be all under the optic of the or their agenda is set entirely by an executive. Yeah. But equally, the counter argument to that is, well, the non-executives are not running the business and they shouldn't interfere.
No,
you have to get the right balance.
But I guess it's if you start interfering in decision making at that level, then you're probably going too far. But if you use it as
absolutely
good insights as to what's going on in the business, then you're probably using it well. And next question, Barry, I know that you are passionate about diversity on boards, and you've talked a lot about it previously. How do you feel the diversity on boards movement is going, and sort of what are your bugbears or things you'd like to change or accelerate?
Well, there is absolutely no question that we do need more diversity on boards. I don't think there's any question about that. We need that different approach, different backgrounds, thinking, different mindset. I do think there are some challenges to it in that if you, as you seek to manage diversity on boards and bring different people onto boards, they need to be well supported. I think it has to be underpinned by a good level of training across the whole board so that everyone is up to the same level on the base governance training, but perhaps on understanding of financial markets, accounting standards. Don't leave this to the experts. I think if a board's going to do a good job, every member of the board should have a good working knowledge and so that they're able to take part in the debate. I think in some of the work I did for BoardX last year, and that I prepared and contributed the forward for their global leadership diversity report, 110 pages, and I must confess I went slightly quiet when they asked me to write the forward to it. I thought, well, where on earth do I start? But following on from that, we did a series of interviews with non-executives on a range of companies around the world, actually, and it was absolutely fascinating to try and understand at first hand how those boards felt they were tackling the diversity agenda. And I think my summary from that was that boards are giving this huge amount of consideration, all sorts of initiatives in place to try and do this. They want to try and make sure there's a really good mix coming through on the board. There is scope always for an alternative view, different thinking. They don't fall into the danger of groupthink. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I do slightly sense that a lot of boards feel they're being beaten up for not having done enough, or the results not having come through already. And one hears that sort of quite strongly. So I think we've all got to be respectful. We've also got to recognise that we're trying to get and trying to make some real progress in this area, and try and improve the atmosphere into which this can be accelerated and developed further. I mean, one of the non-execs we spoke to, who is on a number of international boards, pointed out that of the companies that we've seen grow from nothing in the US of late, been a few over here, but particularly citing Google and Apple and Uber and all these sort of companies, a number of these were set up, developed from scratch by someone who was an immigrant to that country, an immigrant to they came in, they were hungry, they had different ideas, they came from a different culture. And, it's absolutely unassailable. We do need difference if we're going to really have strong companies that are able to navigate the times that we're going through. So I'm a massive fan. Whether or not we totally going about it in the right way, not always comfortable, but there we are. I mean, I think it's by its very nature, it's an ongoing debate. Provided we do have an ongoing and respectful debate about it, we'll get there and we'll get the benefits from it.
Barry, you were talking about the sort of catchphrases earlier. We had a pre-conversation, and Barry said we hear about male, stale, and pale, or more Daves and Steves and footsie boards than women and things like that. And actually, wouldn't it be great to come up with a new catchphrase that kind of helps to create a positive and healthy debate around diversity? The best I've come up with so far is instead of ticking boxes towards diversity, wouldn't it be great if we danced towards dynamism? Just look at how can we be more positive, aspirational, and creative actually in how we get a good mix on boards. But Barry, as a white man, that comment, male, stale, and pale, how do you think that has impacted this narrative and sort of the move towards trying to get a better mix on boards?
Well, look, be sure it's an immensely powerful shorthand, and I think it conveys a very powerful message. But it's equally sort of quite simplistic. So yes, it would be great to come up with a slightly different way of approaching it. I mean, from my perspective, I suppose that I found myself a couple of weeks ago. I did a Zoom call with my French teacher. I have a French teacher in Angoulême, and we Zoom each other pretty regularly. And I've been learning French now for about 4 years. Some would say there's no particular signs that I'm learning anything, but I did both Latin and French at school and managed to leave school without particularly any signs of the effort going into that language learning. But a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak at the School of Engineers in Angoulême to a whole group of very bright early 20s engineering students that have to learn English as part of their program. And, frankly, it was an immense privilege to be asked to do that. I think it was huge fun. But it's all a matter of that different perspective. There they were from a number of international French companies, Bouygues and Orange and all these sort of well-known names that we come across here. And for me, anyway, I felt it was huge privilege. It was great fun, but actually it really opened my mind up, I think, yet again, to some of the challenges inherent in how we try and manage our businesses and how we try and make sure, there's a high degree of diversity. From their point of view, their big concern was to make sure that, they had a working business proficiency in English. And again, that's a really interesting barrier, isn't it? That for those of us who are native English speakers, we don't have that problem. But what I would say is that if you try to learn a foreign language, and particularly at a slightly older age, you get a bit of a sense as to what it might be like. So sometimes putting yourself in the other person's point of view can be a good approach. So it isn't always comfortable.
And finally, Barry, closing thoughts. What would your message be for someone that maybe has had some exposure to governance, maybe through their full-time role, and is maybe thinking about going for their first non-exec role?
Be prepared to apply some energy. Think very, very carefully about how you want to position yourself. Try to guard against being pigeonholed because you're seen to come from a particular background or people's skill set. Try to read quite broadly about governance. I particularly commend actually the Quoted Companies Alliance Corporate Governance Code, which I think is a terrific short. It's not a long booklet. I think you probably have to buy it from the QCA, but it's a very, very good booklet which just describes the basic elements of governance and why these are important. And I think that will help you get into the language and develop your skill set, so you're positioned to start the journey. I mean, whether you start by dynamic boards or any other way. It's a fascinating area. I think the challenges remain. I don't think it's an easy job. It's probably got tougher to do, but equally the rewards of being there and seeing the organisation, whether it be a charitable organisation or whether it be a for-profit organisation, developing and growing as a result of your quiet influence, or being prepared just to sit there and listen and act as a sounding board, which is often the value of a non-executive, can be immensely rewarding. So hopefully it's a path that you'll enjoy treading.
Thank you, Barry. And lastly, I know Barry's next topic for a debate is this House believes that good chairmen are born, not made. That's a good controversial one you got there, Barry. So look forward to hearing about that next time we speak.
Well, we're continuing the tradition of being edgy, perhaps even a little bit provocative. But at the end of the day, we'll be looking to have respectful debate with a lot of listening and exploring an alternative view. And I think I've got a woman, former Ned to watch, former president of the Cambridge Union, who is going to be involved in that. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun exploring that, and a great deal of insight will emerge, and we'll all learn. And hopefully, as a result, that will advance the debate in the broadest sense.
We definitely need more debate. Thank you, Barry. Take care.
Thank you very much.